There's a moment, just before you speak, where you still have complete control. The second the words leave your mouth, that control is gone forever. And most people never notice that moment. They just talk. They react. They fill the silence because silence feels uncomfortable. But here's something almost nobody tells you. The most powerful people in any room are usually not the ones talking the most. They're the ones who know exactly when to say nothing at all. Today, I want to walk you through 7 specific situations where silence isn't weakness, it isn't fear, and it isn't avoidance. It's strategy. It's self-respect. And in some cases, it's the only thing standing between you and a decision you'll regret for years. Let's start with the first one. When you're angry. Not mildly annoyed. Angry. The kind where your chest feels tight and your thoughts start moving faster than your mouth can keep up with. Psychologists have a simple way of explaining what happens in your brain during that state. The amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for threat detection and emotional reaction, essentially hijacks the prefrontal cortex, which is the part responsible for reasoning, judgment, and long-term thinking. In plain language, your emotional brain takes the wheel and your logical brain gets shoved into the back seat. This is why people say things during arguments that they would never say if they'd waited even 5 minutes. You're not lying in that moment. You're just not thinking clearly. And words spoken from that place tend to aim for maximum damage instead of honest resolution. So the rule is simple. When the anger is loud, let your mouth stay quiet. Not forever. Just long enough for your prefrontal cortex to climb back into the driver's seat. The second situation is when someone is clearly trying to provoke you. You've felt this before. Someone says something specifically designed to get a reaction out of you. Maybe it's a jab dressed up as a joke. Maybe it's a comment meant to make you defend yourself in public. The moment you respond with equal energy, you've done exactly what they wanted. You've handed them control of the conversation. Silence, in this case, isn't submission. It's refusal. It says, I see what you're doing, and I'm not participating. There's an old idea, sometimes attributed loosely to various wisdom traditions, that the angriest person in a room usually loses the argument because they've lost their composure. When you don't take the bait, you stay the only calm person in the exchange, and calm people almost always come across as the more credible ones. The third situation is when you don't yet have all the facts. This one is harder to notice because it doesn't feel emotional. It feels like helpfulness. Someone shares half a story, and your brain, which is wired to find patterns and fill in gaps, immediately constructs the rest. You form an opinion. You might even share that opinion out loud, confidently, as if you know the whole picture, but you don't. This happens constantly with gossip, with office politics, with family conflicts. The version of events you heard first is rarely the complete version. Staying quiet until you actually understand the situation isn't indecisiveness. It's intellectual honesty. It protects you from becoming the person who spreads a story that later turns out to be wrong. And it protects the people involved from being judged on incomplete information. The fourth situation is when your words won't change anything. This is a subtle one because we often speak just to relieve our own discomfort, not because speaking will actually help. Think about moments where you've pointed out a mistake after it was already too late to fix, or criticized a decision that had already been made and couldn't be undone. In those moments, speaking doesn't solve the problem. It just adds weight to something that's already happened. There's a difference between feedback that's useful because it can still shape an outcome, and commentary that only exists to make you feel like you said your piece. Learning to tell those two apart is one of the most underrated forms of emotional maturity. The fifth situation is when you're speaking with someone who has already decided not to listen. You know this type of conversation. No matter what you say, no matter how reasonable or well explained it is, the other person has already made up their mind, and they're just waiting for their turn to talk again. Continuing to argue in that moment doesn't persuade them. It usually does the opposite. It makes them dig in further, because human beings tend to defend their existing beliefs harder when they feel attacked. A pattern researchers call the backfire effect. In situations like these, silence isn't losing the argument. It's recognizing that there was never actually a real conversation happening in the first place, just two people waiting to talk. Save your energy for people who are actually listening. The sixth situation is when sharing something would betray someone else's trust. This one is quieter, but it matters just as much. Maybe a friend told you something private. Maybe you know a piece of information that isn't yours to share. In a moment of conversation, when everyone else seems to be gossiping, opening up, trading secrets, there's a pull to join in, to contribute something, to feel included. But real trust is tested exactly in these ordinary, low-stakes moments, not in dramatic ones. The people who quietly hold information without leaking it, even when no one would ever find out, are the people others eventually trust with everything. That kind of reputation is built in silence, one unspoken secret at a time. And the seventh situation, maybe the most important one, is when you're trying to figure out who you actually are. This sounds strange at first, because we usually think of self-discovery as something you talk through, journal about, or explain to other people. But there's real value in sitting with your own thoughts without immediately narrating them to someone else. The moment you explain a half-formed idea out loud, you often lock it into a shape before it's ready. You start defending it instead of exploring it. Some of the clearest thinking happens in the quiet space, before you've told anyone what you think, where you're still allowed to be unsure, still allowed to change your mind, still allowed to sit with a question instead of rushing toward an answer just to fill the silence. If you notice a pattern across all 7 of these, it's this. Silence isn't the absence of something. It's a decision. It takes more control to hold your tongue when you're furious than to let the words fly. It takes more discipline to withhold judgment than to jump to conclusions. It takes more strength to protect someone else's secret than to trade it for a moment of connection. Every single one of these situations asks you to choose restraint over release, and restraint is one of the most underrated forms of power a person can develop. There's a quiet kind of respect that grows around people who know how to do this. Not because they're passive, and not because they're avoiding conflict out of fear, but because they've learned that not every reaction needs to be expressed the second it appears. The next time you feel that pull to speak, that itch in your chest telling you to respond immediately, pause for just one breath and ask yourself which of these 7 situations you're actually in. More often than you'd expect, the answer will tell you that silence is the stronger move. If this gave you something to think about, take a second to like the video. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. And if you want more of this kind of thinking, subscribe, because there's a lot more coming. Before you go, I'd love to know, which of these 7 situations do you personally struggle with the most? The one where staying quiet feels the hardest for you? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.